folks. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Caro. I use any pronouns. We'll introduce ourselves in a bit, and we'll tell you about our workshop called The Business of Publishing, how we got the idea, what we taught to graduate students about publishing practices, and how we were able to put this workshop on through the libraries. And we'll tell you a little bit about research that we did on this population of students who participated in a few iterations of this workshop over the course of a year or two. Hopefully this will be participatory. Please continue to use the chat, and we'll have a couple of other hands-on activities for you throughout the thing, TBA. So, but before we get started, let's introduce ourselves. Like I said, my name is Caro. I use any pronouns, and I'm the Public Services Librarian at the Burke Library at Union Theological Seminary. It's a mouthful. It's at Columbia, but I'm a research, instruction, and reference librarian. I work with students at Columbia and graduate students at Union Theological Seminary primarily. And I'll turn it over to Kay.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kay Barra-Crecha. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the social work and professional studies librarian at Columbia University Libraries. So similar to Caro, I liaise to primarily graduate students, but I'm with the School of Social Work and the School of Professional Studies.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Wilson. I'm the head of Open Scholarship Services at the University of Maryland, but I only started in that role in September of last year. So up through the end of the end of the summer of 2022, I was the digital publishing librarian at Columbia, working in the main library and working with the entire university population on publishing projects, digital humanities, and scholarly communications.
So as we get into talking about our workshop, The Business of Publishing, a workshop for graduate professional students at Columbia, we thought we would share with you all an opportunity to, as you've been introducing yourselves in the chat, continue introducing yourselves to us on a Jamboard. If you've ever used a Jamboard before, this is a graphic, participatory, multimedia sort of thing. We're hoping that folks will focus on using sticky notes to introduce themselves and to sort of locate yourselves where you are at your institution. So we'll continue to use Jamboards like these throughout the session. Stay tuned.
So, like we sort of mentioned, we came together from different parts of the libraries at Columbia as two liaison librarians who work primarily with master's students, graduate students in professional level programs. So we kind of identified a gap in publishing education in those kinds of programs. Undergraduates at Columbia get information literacy instruction from librarians sort of in a systematic way in their first year writing courses. And PhD students get publishing instruction through their PhD programs. But we are kind of seeing that master's students don't get systematic publishing instruction necessarily, or systematic information literacy instruction. So we were kind of hoping that our workshop would be able to provide some information literacy, especially with a focus on the ACRL frame of information creation as a process. One of the things that we knew we would be dealing with as we developed this workshop is the fact that master's programs at Columbia, and even if you're only focusing on sort of the professional master's programs, so master's programs that are going to go into professions that aren't necessarily academic and aren't necessarily going to go on to a PhD, is what I mean when I say professional level. Those programs include a diverse audience with widely varying goals for their publishing and their writing, and also widely varying levels of experience. So ultimately, our goal with developing the workshop was to create a practical skill building space and a space for sort of self-empowerment, so that students would be able to find discipline-specific information about publishing and not necessarily to address every single potential situation that students might be in.
Speaking of sort of professional graduate students, we put a fair amount of thought into the logistics of setting up a workshop that we could actually attract a variety of participants to, who would actually show up and be present and participating online. So we did put a fair amount of thought into setup for that. While I tell you about that, we have a second Jamboard for you. It is Jamboard number 2 in the deck that we sent. We'll put that link in the chat to Hootsuite. The second Jamboard asks, what population at your own institution are you considering for a business of publishing workshop? I've put an example sticky note on there. For example, Columbia master's level students, but maybe think about who you have in mind for this, since you're here today with us now. So thinking about timing, we're thinking about professional level students who might be any kind of age range, but we wanted to do a evening workshop so that folks who were working 9 to 5 and taking classes in the evening could come to an evening workshop. All of our regular hours are daytime-ish, but we wanted to extend this into an evening opportunity. To advertise it, we made this lovely poster that you've seen on some of our slides. There were some weird aspects of advertising it because we were doing research on the participants with an IRB that limited the amount of digital advertising we were able to do within the university. Happy to talk more about that later when we talk about our research if folks have questions about that. But we really relied on posters situated in graduate instruction and leisure and study spaces around the university. This was during a pandemic years. This is from sort of 2020, 21, 2022. We did host these workshops via Zoom, and we'll talk about the unique sort of pedagogical challenges and opportunities that Zoom affords that I'm sure folks are familiar with. But these were some of the logistics that we considered as we set up and promoted this workshop opportunity to graduate students. This is so interesting, this Jamboard. Folks are thinking about offering this for graduate students, for undergrads, for nursing students. There's a lot of opportunities that we could talk about. We had a few objectives that we wanted to make sure we covered with our workshop. One of the goals we had was to just have students start thinking about setting their own goals. If they're coming to a publishing workshop, what are they interested in doing with their own writing? Why are they interested in publishing, right? So doing a little bit of this metacognition. As I tell you about more of our workshop learning objectives, we have yet another Jamboard for y'all. This is just an option. But to be thinking a little bit about your own goals and what you might want to accomplish in a workshop like this. One thing we wanted to do was to help students start to identify potential platforms that they might want to publish on, just getting from I want to publish to, okay, where? And then from that, learning how to contact editors, navigate the nuts and bolts of authorship agreements and copyright, thinking about licensing their work and the different interplays there. And then also thinking generally about who they know, who they could network with, and opportunities to build their network on a social level. Our learning objectives Jamboard, just if you feel like sharing, what additional learning objectives or goals would you have for attendees of a workshop like this at your own home institution?
So as we've sort of been mentioning, the philosophy of the workshop was really focused on students feeling ready to set their own goals and sort of take their own steps that made sense for their contexts as writers and people who wanted to publish. This kind of aligns with what the research tells us about increasing self-efficacy in students, which is the belief that the students believe that they can accomplish things on their own, that they have the skills and knowledge they need to, take steps to accomplish their goals. Increasing self-efficacy in students leads to increased rates of graduation in first-generation college students and adult learners in graduate programs in general. So that is, one of the reasons we kind of focused on goal setting and sort of like choosing your own path as a writer so much. So with that, we can move into talking about the actual activities that we did in the workshops. So the first one was the goal setting activity. And we kind of did this in a few different places. The first place that we did this was just encouraging students to think about reasons that they might want to publish their work, whether that would be for, just to get paid to be a writer, whether it's to gain academic experience and visibility, to share their ideas, to perhaps, try to start to become a thought leader in their field, to engage in conversations. So we wanted them to think about those things so that eventually they could figure out what the best kind of platform would be for them to actually publish. And we also sort of wanted to help manage expectations about whether it would be possible or realistic for them to make money out of writing, because we know that not all types of publication actually pay writers, or even if they do pay writers, they may not pay a living wage. The other thing we had students do in terms of goal setting was to actually, write down a goal in terms of communicating with a person who could help them. So we asked them to identify a person they already know who might be able to give them some advice about publishing in their field, or to use a search engine to find a relevant conference, event, or group to meet up with someone else or another, a group of people. The next one that we did was a sort of like hands-on submissions guidelines activity. So for this one, we had students take a look at one of 3 publications and really focus in on that publication submission guidelines page. And we asked them to answer these questions. So what does the publication look for in submissions? Are writers paid for their articles? And if so, how much? Who owns the copyright? Is it, the author or the publication once the item is published? And could you submit a post or a piece of writing that you already published on your own blog for this publication? So the idea here was to get students used to, first of all, identifying where on a website a submissions page might be located, and 2, what to look for in submissions guidelines.
The third activity that we did with students, which was always noted in some of our materials that we collected from students as being very popular, was to read through 2 author contracts with a checklist to help familiarize students. Once we talked a little bit about some definitions of copyright and licensing and gave them a sense of what their rights as authors were, how to read through and understand an author contract. The idea was to first and foremost empower students that they should be reading their author contracts and thinking about their author rights, and that they would have the ability, based on some of those goals that we had them set out at the beginning of the workshop, to think about whether or not the terms of an author agreement were in line with what their goals were for publishing, in terms of whether or not they would be remunerated for their writing, whether they would retain rights that would allow them to do things with their scholarship or their work in the future. So perhaps they're not going to get paid for this, but they're going to be able to utilize the material in a portfolio or a future publication in a way that still aligns with their goals. And so that empowerment piece and that emphasis on using your ability to read through an author contract and stand up for your rights as a way to align yourself with your goals and make decisions about your writing that align with, what works for you was, again, very important in this activity. We had 2 author contracts that we gave the students access to. One was the Columbia Library's journal publishing contract. So the contract that we had developed and used with all of the authors who are publishing articles in journals in our open access publishing program. So very permissive contract that allowed authors to retain copyright and a whole host of rights related to future use and licensing of the content. And then an agreement that came to us courtesy of a university press who are very generous in allowing us to use a copy, anonymized copy of their contract, which had, because the university press was, working in a more commercial context, had slightly different terms. And we used a author contract checklist to alert students to the kinds of things that they should be looking for when they're reading through an author contract. So, who retains the copyright? In what parts of the world are people allowed to publish or reuse this material? Can it be translated into other languages? Does the copyright transfer permanently? Is the license for, in perpetuity, or is there a term limit on, how long this author contract will be? And so we would read through or pose a question or two from different areas of this checklist to the students and ask them to read through the 2 agreements to help them to start to look through some of that legalese and also model some of the words like non-exclusive, perpetual worldwide rights, things like that, to help them to start to penetrate what is, I think, a pretty intimidating document and realize that they can pull useful information that can help them to make those decisions out of the author contracts.
So before and after we did this whole workshop with, activities and exercises and getting to know each other. Oh, I see a question in the chat. How long is the workshop? You're covering a lot. Great question. We budgeted 90 minutes start to finish, including time for folks to do these surveys. It was a lot. It did feel like a lot to get into the time. We took a 10-minute break somewhere in there too, I believe. So we surveyed the participants before and after with an institutional review board approved set of both quantitative and qualitative questions. We wanted to find out what students sort of understood before coming into the workshop, what was their or the reasons for coming to the workshop. And then also, after the workshop, we wanted to survey them to see what some of the effects are, so did they gain confidence? Did we succeed in our learning objectives? Things like that. So in the top half of this slide that you're looking at, we asked them in the post survey, what is the most important thing you came to this workshop to learn about and why? Answers from how to get published, straightforward, to how to get self-published works into public domain publishings, into libraries, what to do with one's own thesis, new procedures that you don't know. Anything from, do I need an agent? How do I get one? In the lower left, we asked folks both before and after the workshop, how confident do you feel? How confident do you feel in your ability to take concrete steps toward getting your work published? In the pre-workshop, it really runs the gamut. A couple of 1s, couple of 2s, not so many 5, from a scale of 1, not confident, to 5, very confident. These numbers seemed to drift closer to the 5, very confident, in the post-workshop, although we'll note that we did have a small sample size, even, between all of these workshops. I think there were about a dozen survey participants. So, and then the sample size shrinks from the pre to the post test. Obviously, at the end of the workshop, folks tend to drop off from the Zoom, drop off from the webinar. We've all seen this. People leave early. And then, we also asked them questions like, what is the difference between a copyright and a license in the post test, just to see what they retained. And, through these open-ended questions, we did see folks were able to sort of re-articulate some of these concepts in their own words. So we judged that a success in terms of some of our learning outcomes.
Some takeaways that we had from designing the workshop as well were that this particular audience, so we know that people are attending today to work with, different audiences. So, students who are in certain professional programs or even undergraduates, but specifically one of the things that we hypothesized about and that we found to be true was that these students just don't receive the same kinds of support that master or graduate students who are on PhD track will receive from peers and from mentors, so cohorts or other programming that are put on for PhD students that are specific to scholarly publishing that tend to take place in sort of like a peer-to-peer or mentorship setting within their departments. And master's students, terminal master's students just don't tend to develop the same kinds of mentorship relationships with faculty members and are generally not kind of like afforded those same resources or communities that can help them to learn about publishing. And so they're not necessarily provided with the same or appropriate resources that they need in order to be able to feel that confidence in the publishing space, even though publishing can be incredibly important for them depending on what their career is going to be going forward. And so we felt like libraries could really be leading in this area by collaborating with faculty, liaison librarians, with different schools or programs to offer information literacy programming and curricular or extracurricular programs like these in order to be able to fill that gap for master's level students and give them the information. However, we know that this kind of information does require a bit of specialized or specialized expertise in order to be able to run a workshop like this. So it was one of the benefits of us working collaboratively across the libraries that Kay and Caro were able to identify and to advertise this opportunity to students that they were working with and to help me to understand, what the needs and like desires of that population were. And we did refine the content over time. But as someone who has worked in the publishing industry and works in scholarly communications, I was able to bring that knowledge and that information into the design of the workshop itself and some of the activities. And so that skill of understanding publishing and scholarly communications is not necessarily something that exists on every staff, even at an academic library, particularly if you're from a smaller institution, you may not have a dedicated scholarly communications or publishing librarian or someone who can focus on teaching and education in that regard. And so one of the other takeaways that we had with this workshop was that, there is value in us sort of curating, or we published, or we presented on this at ACRL or presenting here. We published a paper alongside our presentation at ACRL where we included recommendations for our community in terms of resources on publishing, helping people to find things to self-educate in the event that you would like to do a workshop like this with your own community and don't have a publishing or scholarly communications librarian to partner with to give you that expertise. And also, the idea that we would make the workshop materials and activities themselves available. So we put a few resources on self-education on publishing here, but we've also included, there's a final Jamboard. So as you're thinking about who you might collaborate with on your own campus, or what kinds of resources, if you have a really great, if you're a ScholComm librarian and there's a great toolkit or resource that you would like to tell others about, or something that's helped you to provide publishing or copyright education, that would be a great place to share that as well.
So thank you for participating on the Jamboards that we created and shared with you. We'd welcome questions at this time, I think. Thank you. This was fun. Thanks for having us.